Hello and welcome to today's Finextra Research webinar, Global Workforce Payments, Mastering a World of Complexity. I'm Scott Hamilton, contributing editor for Finextra, and I'm here to lead a conversation on that topic and a few others. Though before we jump into the topic, we've got three wonderful experts on our panel, thought leaders from the global payments and clearing world. I'll give you some quick announcements first. First, please ask questions. We will do all we can to answer as many as we can during the session. You'll also have a chance to weigh in on poll questions at 3 points during our conversation today. So please take the opportunity to share your thoughts at those times. Also, download the workforce payments ebooks and other information and cross-border fraud awareness resources provided, courtesy of our sponsor, Papaya Global. You'll find them enclosed on screen. It's indeed a fascinating and complex topic, workforce payments, and how to make sure they're done right. It's an application and a challenge that I personally have discussed and collaborated with clients and colleagues about for quite a few years now, though it's always changing. And it's one of those good news and cautionary tales all in one. There's no real bad news here. That's because people working for companies and organizations in various places around the globe, it's become much more common, yet it's also become even more complex than it ever was before the pandemic, and certainly before that, though cross-border commerce was already growing quickly throughout the early part of this century, aided by the continued expansion of the internet, global relationships, and so forth. Now, as you've seen in our description of this session, it's not just about paying people here or there, though that's important enough on its own. It's planning, execution, and continued support. There's so many choices and channels. It's how you pay them, tailoring your approach based on what sorts of workers they are to you. For example, how they're classified in terms of being contract providers or permanent employees, and in the particular area of the world where they perform work for your organizations. All sorts of legal and regulatory differences apply. So for many working hybrid or remote or even at an overseas subsidiary, that means local options may be available to venture well beyond their payors or their company's normal payment territory. And with this comes complexities in how they get compensated, by type of payment, in what currency, and definitely how well they are supported before, during, and after, with the almost invariable questions that are going to arise. These are delicate and often personal arrangements that must be put in place to make sure they're paid on time and as expected every time. Now, in addition to all these factors, and perhaps over and above all else, business continuity and ongoing resilience are at stake through keeping an engaged and talented workforce happy wherever they are. These are just some of the topics we're going to be tackling today, and to help us get into them, I'd like to welcome our esteemed panelists, Jonathan Nash, Senior Director of Payments for Papaya Global, our sponsor, Carbon Gursky, Global Payments Lead, Wells Fargo, Sanjeev Bhatti, Product Management, Direct Clearing for BNY. Jonathan, let's kick off that conversation with you. If you could give us an overview of today's global workforce payroll scene, tell us about the challenges and opportunities involved, why we're talking about this today, as opposed from any other kind of domestic or even a cross-border payment use case.
Of course. Thank you very much for having me, and thanks, Scott, for the intro. So workforce payments are often forgotten amongst many in regards to the payments world, but are by and large the most important payments that any company will pay. As many businesses will say, you're nothing without your workers, and ultimately paying people on time is more important than ever with the economic climate we're in, with cost of living rising and so on. So ultimately, payments as a whole are becoming more and more important. Paying people in the way in which how they want to be paid, but also on a regulatory perspective, paying them in a compliant way is super important too. Across the world, payments are not the same. People treat payroll payments or workforce payments as they are invoices. They are not. If you pay a worker late a couple of days, no matter how good your relationship with them they are, they're going to be pretty frustrated and pretty unhappy, and there might be legal breaches that you're ultimately dealing. So ultimately, being able to pay people on time and in full is absolutely critical. So what we're here to talk about today is kind of, again, what the workforce market is, how people are changing the way that they want to be paid, whether that be crypto, whether that be a standard bank transfer, or other weird and wonderful methods that are coming into the world. The whole of COVID has changed the way that we consume pay as a workforce. So yeah, really excited for today's session. The complexity of payroll payments or workforce payments are immense. Each country has its own regulatory approach, not only for net salaries, but then you have the tax elements, the withholdings, the social security, and then obviously the benefits, things like pensions and so on. So we all always think about the net salaries, the easy part, but we also then have to take into consideration those other elements that are very important to the workforce element. These are also traditionally the most expensive part of any business. That being said, I did say that to a jet manufacturing company, a private jet manufacturing company, and they very quickly corrected me that maybe not all businesses are their workforce their most expensive element. But it's a very, very key part for sure.
Awesome. Great kickoff there. Thank you very much, Jonathan. Carmen, you've served in global payments roles for large banks. You have tremendous expertise going back with cross-border transactions. We had a great conversation about that before we got into the webinar. Help us understand just how differing countries' regulations on taxes, security, other issues add complexity and nuance to these global workforce payments. And what are overseas workers looking for? I know we talked about that. How are payment providers meeting those specific needs? Because it's definitely not easy, as Jonathan's talked about.
No, absolutely, and agree with everything Jonathan mentioned, right? Especially also like Jonathan said, in today's economy, right, with high inflation, with workers engaged in new right types of employment than the traditional ones. The fact that we need to ensure they are paid not maybe once a month or twice a month, as most of us are used, but being paid once a week or perhaps every day, right? So ensure that we are 24/7 there to enable these flows and money, which is very important, right, for lots of workers, and ensure that we support most of those hard money, right, to reach them, especially like Jonathan and you, Scott, mentioned in the cross-border instance, whereas we know sometimes different payment arrangements lead to deductions from those hard-earned paychecks. And we want to ensure that as much as possible of the money that's earned by the workers get into their paycheck. We do that by connecting our platforms directly or with partnerships with other banks or with fintech providers in different markets into newer payment rails or some existing payment rails that ensure that type of wholeness of the payroll into the worker's account. For example, we partner with, as I mentioned, banks or fintechs in countries such as UK or Australia or India and other right throughout the world to take advantage of converting one type of payment. Let's say we initiated that payment in a wire cross-border into a real-time payment. That ensures that no deductions are taken, that the payment gets there the fastest to the employee, and that it is processed in the most efficient way and transparent. Also very important, in addition to ensuring the wholeness of the payment in the employee's account, is if we are talking about a cross-border payment, how much of that gets converted in the local currency. If the employer is sending, let's say, the payment in US dollars and it needs to be converted in, let's say, Australian dollars, what type of FX capability the provider has to convert that as the tightest spread in terms of the FX conversion, similarly to ensure that the employee receives most of the payment. Also very important is for all of us, right, whether we're making, commercial payments or retail payments or payroll payments, is to have transparency end-to-end into that payment. I want to know how much I'm going to pay for that payment, right? When I initiate a payment, I want to know what FX rate is going to be applied to that payment and how much the employee is going to get. And both me as the employer as well as the employee want to know where the payment is. When am I going to receive it, right? How much do you estimate upfront? What's the timeline? And then I want to be able to track it to see if it's stuck somewhere or if it reached my account or perhaps, God forbid, fraud occurred during the processing of that payment and maybe the payment is in a different account. So I want to know real time where my payroll is and to be able to have those tools on my mobile, on my online banking or any other channels that I'm using to be able to track that particular transaction. So those would be some top of mind, but there are many, many others, and probably we'll get into some of the questions that we'll receive into the data related, into the fraud related to these transactions.
We certainly will, and you've given an excellent overview, Carmen. In fact, this just brings back lots of memories of a lot of those problems you talked about that certainly were really much more difficult to solve in the past, although there's some specialization here. Sanjeev, thoughts you might add to those of your other panelists, and tell us a bit about how those global payments for workers really stand out as different from other payments applications, especially between countries. Also, it's tough to achieve that simplicity that Carmen's talking about, where everything just kind of works. How are banks and other providers making this easier for everyone, even with all this customization required?
Yeah, thanks, Scott. Yeah, and as Jonathan and Carmen both said as well, these payroll payments are some of the most important that are carried out globally anyway. I think the three most important types of payments are payroll, pensions, and benefits. And as someone who is an employee of BNY, I know that I want my payment to be received on the same, it needs to be predictable. It needs to be on the day, I need to know when it's going to come and how much I'm going to receive. And the reason for that is straightforward. I've got bills to pay. I want to make sure I can pay my mortgage, my energy bills, and so I need that reliability. And with cross-border payments, that's more difficult because it's while the infrastructure is improving, it hasn't always been historically that level of transparency. Plus, you have the impact potentially of things like deductions, as Carmen Jonathan mentioned, but also with FX exchange rates as well. So, for someone who's based in the UK, if someone was based in the UK and they were receiving the payments in dollars, the value of what they're getting in the last couple of weeks would have changed dramatically with how the exchange rate changed. It's also important for the companies themselves. I've started my own businesses in the past and run a business as well, and I know that the payroll is, like as John said, many companies, obviously not all, is their biggest expense. It's stressful for the company as well because you need to make sure everything's correct. There's timelines, different calculations, regulatory changes, tax changes, and if you get it wrong, if a payment's a little bit later than usual, it makes all the rest of the team, all the employees, worry about how sustainable this is, even if it's not your fault. I remember at one point I was running a company and there was a national CHAPS payment system outage. And it was in the news, everyone knew this was going on, but they didn't worry, they weren't blaming the banks, they were coming to me saying, what's going on? Why haven't I got my pay at this time? They all got it the same day, but it causes stress. And banks need to make this as simple as possible for companies as well. So this hasn't been done very well in the past, but we are improving, and we have quite good capabilities in this area now. So, for example, we offer API connectivity. So rather than having to go and initiate payments, you can link it directly to your software, your payroll software. Additionally, we have a low-value payment solution where you can instruct payments for one account instead of multiple currencies. And more, there's banks across the globe focusing on this area. They realize that this low-value payments across the globe is something that needs to be focused on, needs to improve, be improved, because we're getting more of a global workforce, and we need to accommodate, we adapt to meet that need more better than ever in the past.
Thank you. Again, this isn't a simple process. It's very specialized. We're going to start with our first poll for our audience today. The question is, what is your biggest challenge related to workforce payments? Is it managing those FX multi-currency payments, delays in them, compliance with, let's face it, local tax regulations, ensuring payment accuracy and timeliness, or we don't experience any challenges? Those are your choices. Feel free to answer the poll, and we'll come back to the results in a few here. Jonathan, while we're waiting for that, any comments regarding Sanjeev's or Carmen's opening remarks, and talk perhaps a little about visibility and tracking? That was something Carmen mentioned very clearly. Sanjeev just talked about it as well, how things have improved. Is it working as well as it should for most people? And how can we improve it versus standard approaches? I think you're on mute.
Sorry, that mute button gets me every time. What I was going to say is we all take for granted being paid, right? We all just get paid in the paycheck and we all think, oh, it's magic. It happens, and we don't realize the complexity that actually goes on in the background. So as Carmen and Sanjeev have said, it's super important to really kind of delve deeper into this process. The payroll world for payments is also kind of dealing with fintech 10 years ago. If I told you the biggest revelation in fintech has been a custom bank file per bank, that's probably not far from the truth, which is fundamentally an Excel document that's encrypted with your personal information and your salary. There's not much technology that's been built purposefully for this use case of workforce payments. Everyone kind of has addressed the invoice payment world, the kind of treasury management world, but the workforce payment world has really been left behind for purpose-built technology or technology that really solves for those problems. And as we've all kind of said, no one's really asking for a lot. It's, can you deliver payments on time at the same time every single month? And can you guarantee that they're going to receive their full amount? Would anyone here accept $50 short on their paycheck every month? Probably not. You'd be shouting at your HR team or your payroll team about kind of what's gone on. Famous phrase in the payroll world: no one thanks anyone in the payroll team for doing their job properly. But boy, do we jump up and down if it goes wrong, right? So ultimately, it's the most important part of the payroll process, and then goes into the people process, the well-being, and much, much more. And ultimately, through the banking network and through the payment rails that we're kind of mentioning, we're looking to kind of improve those visibility and the tracking of those payments. Again, going back to kind of what Carmen mentioned around a bank holding a payment for additional compliance checks, that's the worst case scenario for a payroll payment, right? You're dealing with someone who might have a mortgage to pay. Then you're calling the bank saying, what's going on? Well, it's stuck. Well, how long is it stuck for? It's an incredibly complex narrative or thing to kind of navigate. So purpose-built technology in this space is something that is definitely required and needs to be pushed. And as I said, payroll payments are incredibly complex country to country. They are not one shoe size fits all, and it is an ever moving target. It doesn't always stay the same. The way you pay your taxes may change month to month, country to country. So we've seen around 4 or 5 countries change the way that tax has to be paid over the last 6 months alone, with Singapore being one of the latest as of next month, where tax has to be paid by direct debit rather than an international wire, for example. But then also, I think Sanjeev mentioned a really important point around, and Carmen, around how you actually deliver the payment using a SWIFT, or whether you have to use a local salary SEPA payment with the right purpose code, whether you have to use gyro payment in markets. The actual payment type is incredibly important as well. So payroll payments are complex, digging deep, providing with the teams with transparency and visibility to manage that workforce is an absolute must.
Thanks, Jonathan. And you really illustrate something that I think all of you have mentioned in our conversations, and it's that you're going to have some deep conversations about figuring out how to do this the right way. And there's going to be ongoing maintenance and so forth. It's not something easy to do, all those rails and everything. Carmen, we're going to go ahead and share the results of our poll, But anything to add to your fellow panelists' points? We'll talk a little about the poll. Any further thoughts on these actual payment journeys, how you have to customize them to those specific needs, finding those more efficient mechanisms, rails, you talked about it a little bit. Jonathan just gave us some examples. I'm sure he's had conversations on these specifically. How you complete those payments and handle them locally, deal with those FX issues. And then we'll talk about the poll. By the way, the biggest number here is compliance. Second is payment accuracy and timeliness. No big surprise there, I guess. And then, of course, it's all international. So right in the middle is where our challenges are. Carmen.
So absolutely, and to address the main one, right, around the compliance and the payment accuracy, actually the second one as well, right, as well as actually the third one, right. So we, as financial institutions, sit on an immense amount of data from our clients, right, from their clients, from the beneficiaries, from the originators of the payments, and everybody in between. And while we are on our journey, right, to deploy this data efficiently, both for internal and external purposes, I think it's very important to look how internally, right, we have different use cases to streamline these payroll payments. For example, we know that these payments are repeat payments, that every month, right, or every 2 weeks or every day, as we said, right, a worker will be paid. As such, we have information around the beneficiary, their accounts, right, their address, and any other attributes related to that particular beneficiary. And as Jonathan said, and perhaps I agree or disagree to a certain extent, depending what type of client you are servicing, right? If you are servicing a smaller client, which has, some older legacy platforms that they are using, yes, probably an integration, it's a little bit, less complex, and the way they deliver the data to you is less complex. But on the other end of the spectrum, as you deal with large corporates, large financial institutions, large public sector entities, right, the integration is much tighter, right, via APIs or via electronic banking platforms, right, host to host, and other types of very tight integrations to make everything secure and delivered as much as error-free as possible. But coming back to the idea of having these repeat payments and knowing the information, right, on the beneficiaries. So what we are creating is, on one hand, customized solutions where our clients can store their data. And when we run that payment through different, whether it's a repair, because perhaps the payment instruction came a bit differently from last time, or whether it's a sanction, right, review of a payment, we already have that information. So we can go to those internal repositories that we've created, right, for clients, and ping the information from there, and then have that payment being analyzed or repaired, right, sanction screened very fast without any manual intervention. And having it, in and out of our walls within seconds, right, compared to up to hours, or God forbid, right, in some cases more than a day. So we use this data once to, deposit it or create these repositories, right, for the clients, and in other instances to deploy, advanced analytical tools, to deploy machine learning, to deploy, AI, which is a term that is very dear, right, to us these days, but to really deploy those advanced technologies in order to analyze the data, again, to analyze it systemically and be able to create rules for those, corporations that are sending these employer payments, so that when the file comes in or individual payment instructions come in, we can, right, based on prior behavior, applying these rules automatically, have the payments screened and out of the door, as I mentioned, in seconds. So that's one of the goals. Another use of data in employee payments and beyond is upfront in terms of screening those payments for any fraud, right, related. Are we seeing the payment perhaps, right, very much increased, right, than past payments? Are we seeing some changes? Perhaps the beneficiary account, it's matching, the beneficiary name, it's matching, but now there is a new beneficiary account, right, that we've seen before. So all those data elements can come together and give us a picture, and be able to advise the corporation that sent that particular payment whether a fraud, right, might be in question for that particular transaction, and kind of like engage then the sender of the payment in a dialogue to determine if it is indeed a legit payment, or if perhaps they want us to take some measures to, stop the payment, or if the payment might have been processed to recall it, engage downstream partners, and so on. So those are two examples, right, of deploying the data that we receive for the employee payments to make it more efficient in terms of processing from a repairs and sanctions perspective, and to make it safer in terms of deploying, right, machine learning in and automation in terms of fraud prevention.
Thanks, Carmen. It's no big surprise that we're talking about data, AI, machine learning, and also fraud in a conversation about payments. God forbid your paycheck gets grabbed because of, or excuse me, in the US, I say paycheck, your payment gets grabbed because of some sort of fraud. Sanjeev, what are some of the things you might add to what Carmen and Jonathan have talked about? Any of the other disciplines that you really have seen need to be prioritized for workforce payments? And I know you've probably got some positive examples, maybe some negative ones. I'm not going to ask you for all of them now. We'll get into it as we go, but especially how you choose the right partners of the system to handle those workforce payments. And also any thoughts you have on the poll that we have in front of us.
That makes sense. Thanks, Scott. I think the most telling stat on the poll really was the fact that the last response, which is we don't have any challenges, 0%. And that shows that maybe.
And we welcome your questions, audience. So yeah, please keep them coming. Go ahead, Sanjeev.
It may be a selection bias in that poll, because that's why people are dialing into this call, because they have issues and they want to find ways around it. But I think as we've kind of covered a couple of points a couple of times already, like the three main elements that need to be focused on are resilience, transparency, and simplicity as well. So these are regular, important, critical payments, and so you need to make sure you've got a resilient platform. And the way to, like a lot of banks, ensure that resilience is as common as thing through use of data, use of AI, use of machine learning, so that when something goes wrong, it's fixed quickly. As far as possible, try to avoid anything going wrong beforehand. There's a careful onboarding process as well. But inevitably, sometimes things do go wrong, and especially with international payments. And that's not down to the banks sending the payment, but it's just because of that long chain of some international payments. An example of payroll payments that have gone wrong for us is that we've got a large client, and one of their clients is a shipping company, and that shipping company has to pay sailors. These are people who travel across the globe, and they're often changed. It's not like a fixed roster of sailors, and they want to get paid in dollars, but they're based, but their home bank is, for example, a rural bank in Estonia or India. And what we found then is sometimes you send payments through, and there's a deduction somewhere down the line. Even though you send an instruction saying do not take a deduction, one bank down the line does take a deduction. And so for the sailors, this can be a stressful situation. They suddenly get a payment that's $15 short, which they weren't expecting. These aren't massive payments anyway, but they're traveling, their family are at home, their family have received this check, it's a bit short. And The simple things for banks to do is to say, look, this is in our T's and C's. It's that we sent it how we should do, but someone else took a deduction. It's not that's not our fault. You have to sort it out. Whereas if you design your product well, like we have in some of our products, is what we have in process with in place with this client is that when they send a payment, we check the beneficiaries. We try to week the payment around any banks that might take a deduction. If a deduction is taken, then we reimburse the beneficiaries as soon as we find out that's happened. And we have that process and it works really well. And as a result, they're happy savers and reputable for other across the business. So,
Hi.
sorry, as you may have noticed, I think my wife has come home, and I'm going to have to let the dog out to say hi to us.
No problem. No, that was an excellent overview. And let's face it, this is not a simple process as we've talked about. Jonathan, your thoughts about the poll results, some of the positives and cautions that you've come up with. You have a particular thought about APIs. Maybe we can talk about that, solving all the problems of the world. And speaking of partners, they're not all the same, are they?
No, I think Sanjeev said it perfectly. The only one that had 0% of people didn't have a problem. And I think exactly as Carmen and Sanjeev said, it's about validation of data is absolutely one of the key elements. We live in a world where challenger banks are coming up through the ranks day in, day out. We're all looking to consume pay in a slightly different way than a high street bank potentially. So people are changing their bank accounts often. They're changing the way and how they consume it and what they want to do with that money. So I think it's really important to validate that data, but also then kind of provide that great end user experience to the employee. We live in a world where employees drive the market as well, still. I know that somewhat has changed, but during the COVID period, we all had a huge hiring issue where workers were driving the market, so to speak. And that's still there, and it's still kind of a part of the point. APIs, of course, huge. Everyone knows about the benefits of API. As I mentioned, in the payroll space, still today, there are Excel files being transferred from one person to another with people's most secure and personal data, like their pay, their name, their bank details, right? So we mentioned the word compliance, yet then there's an Excel file that isn't encrypted with all of that personal data in it, which is an audit nightmare, a GDPR nightmare, amongst many other things like fraud and other things that we don't really want to talk about here, just in case we jinx anything. But it's a hugely important thing. API automation and being able to drive data back and forth is absolutely critical. That allows you to centralize and give a standard global approach. We always focus on one or two of the core markets as well. I think Sanjeev had a really good point around kind of shipping and offshore workers and all sorts of different elements like that. Those payments are incredibly complex on how you do those. Paying to emerging markets, paying in non-local currency. $15 might not sound a lot of money to us in the UK and the States, but across in other parts of the world, $15 is a huge amount of money. So we're here. We want to deliver those payments in the best possible way. The technology infrastructure and the world we live in now, where technology is evolving with AI and all sorts of other things, I think the world is our oyster to really process those payments in a more efficient way. To your point around selecting partners, it's all about compliance. The highest part of your poll is compliance. Payroll payments are not invoices. You cannot just pay them like an international wire. Each country has its own specific legislation on how that payment has to be delivered, from the payment type, whether it be a SWIFT or a local, whether the payment can be sent from a local bank account or from an international bank account, how and when those payments are due. And again, I'll go back to, everyone always thinks about payroll payments as net salaries. They're actually the easy part. Your taxes, your social security, your pensions, and your other benefits are the difficult part. They are not included in bank files. They're very rarely included in host-to-host files. They are solutions that are very manual, that really fall between payroll and finance. It's not really seen as a strategic part. Finance see payroll payments as an annoying necessity. They don't really get data or visibility into the data earlier on enough in the process to make strategic decisions relating to the cash. So how can we do that through the use of technology and APIs and things like that? So going back to your question, Scott, on kind of partners, using partners that really can delve into the complexities of payroll is super important. And I would always say break payroll payments into 4 buckets. Your net is 1, tax is another, other mandatory is your 3rd, and then non-statutory benefits is 4th. Don't look at payroll payments as 1 bucket of nets and everything else kind of happens after. If you want to see what a fine is, go and pay your taxes late a couple of months. They'll either shut you down or your fines will be thousands, if not millions of dollars, depending on the size of your company. They are humongous. So it's a really important part, but also basic things like safeguarding of funds as well. I know I'm kind of jumping around, but it's really important. The payroll world is used to things like trust accounts, used to things like bank files, where pooling of cash, where you're transferring data manually. So APIs, which may seem like something we talked about 10 years ago in the fintech space, are still incredibly relevant across the actual payroll payment market today.
Thank you. You covered a lot of the good news and the bad news if things are done wrong. And I think that's really important. It's a melange of solutions, if you will, but you got to have the providers that can actually step up and do what needs to be done. And that's going to probably vary by country, by currency. Can we bring up the second poll for our audience here? It's, what do you consider to be the most significant compliance challenge? You talked about compliance and managing these cross-border payments. Is it keeping up with all those regulations as they change, ensuring adherence to anti-money laundering and KYC requirements? Is it managing data privacy and security, which we talked about? Or is it complex cross-border tax compliance when you're going from one entity to another and you've got to make sure that you get it right on both ends? Those are our questions for the audience. And Sanjeev, anything to add to what Jonathan just mentioned? He did mention a lot of different scenarios, examples from your experience, where payment providers really did have to step up and meet all those challenges. And, you know, maybe just talk about what should any provider be prepared for to deal with what all these companies and their workers are asking for in the payroll space.
I think that from the good news is there's a lot of focus from a regulatory perspective on these type of payments. So the aim is to make things much more straightforward, much simpler, and ensure better financial outcomes for the people receiving the payments as well. So the roadmap is positive. The downside is that in the short term, or short to medium term, I'd probably say, there's going to be more complexity, because the way people are solving for this is by opening up new schemes, finding new solutions. And so having the right partner to help you navigate through that complexity is essential. One of the things we're working on is a project called Project Agora, which is a public-private collaboration between 7 central banks and 42, 43 financial firms, where we're looking to improve use tokenized assets and tokenized versions of commercial bank and central bank money to improve cross-border transactions. But while all this stuff is being developed, there is increasing complexity up until when, and that's just in the payments aspect. When you look at the elements before that, because Jonathan's mentioned about taxation, changing taxation rules, deductions, etc. That's all. That's all has to be considered as well, because just looking over this year, 2024, on its own, it's been the year of elections, which also links to the year of changing tax policy, and especially when it comes to payrolls, etc. as well. And with all of this, with this level of change and complexity, there is also the risk of increased fraud as well. So as a result of that, people develop solutions which enable real-time monitoring of transactions to spot fraud as well. So one of the solutions that we're working on with Swift is to use AI to carry out an enhanced level of transaction monitoring of cross-border transactions. And also by using privacy-enhancing technology, so you could run your own one bank's transactions through another bank's fraud models. The use of that would be, for example, if someone with a Barclays account is sending a payment to in the UK, sending a payment to the US, Barclays may have good transaction fraud data for the UK, but they wouldn't have such good data for the US. So Barclays could run that transaction through BNY's fraud model to assess whether it's a risk of identity fraud, it's a fraud, or it's an unusual payment for that amount as well. So there's a lot being developed in the area, but there's still a lot of work that needs to be done as well.
It's absolutely fascinating, the amount of inter-organizational cooperation. In many webinars, we've had conversations with various very strong providers on their own. And it seems like they're always saying, if we could only share a little bit of the data, even without names, just so that we could make sure we address or nail these things up front, nail these, whether they be fraudsters, whether they be solving problems like Carmen talked about, and so forth. Speaking of which, we're going to show the results here. Looks like number one is managing that data and privacy, data privacy and security across borders. No big surprise, I guess. Nothing on AML and KYC and keeping up with those regulations and tax compliance. Carmen, quick thoughts on that, and then maybe let us know if there are any surprises and a little bit more about maybe getting the most bang for the buck out of those providers. How can they work with their clients, with those workers to dial things in? Anything you'd add on compliance?
Sure. So just wanted to say that I loved Sanjeev's point around collaboration. And especially as we see, 62% of the audience is saying that security across border and data privacy, it's very, very important and top of mind for them, and rightfully so. Because, as Sanjeev was saying, when we analyze, let's say for security, purposes, and we rely on our own data, and we have, trillions of data points that we are sitting on. But even then, it's not enough, from a fraud perspective, because I would know information on my own customers, and no matter how large, my portfolio is, it's still a finite part of the universe. So I could perhaps, detect something with, or maybe in the 10 or 15% of the cases or so. However, if all the financial institutions, banks, fintechs, and other providers, technology providers, are coming together in a way that, from a data privacy, which again, it's top of mind for everyone, and there are double-blind models out there. There are ways in which we can have, central party that it's engaged in the process, to just look at those pieces of information real time that would give us, information real time to be able to make a decision, using our model, using models that other financial institutions are leveraging to see if a particular transaction, might be a bad one. So I think coming together as an industry, agree 100% with Sanjeev, it's very important to move the needle from that 15%, to perhaps an 80, 90%. And that will allow us not only to, make the transactions much more secure, but it will deter bad actors, because the cost for them to run, their business model, because even, a fraudster and a firm that engages in that type of behavior, it's driven by economics. So if we are making it so expensive, for them, that it's not appealing to be in that business model, it will probably deter their behavior, because it's not worthwhile to pursue. So I think that collaboration going forward is very, very important. Another, I think we got one of the questions from the audience. It's around, are we how are we thinking of distributing, right, the money to the beneficiaries? And obviously, being banks for us, the easiest way it's in the account, right? In the bank account of that particular beneficiary. But as we know, some beneficiaries do not have bank accounts. They might have, digital wallets. They might need to cash the money. So I think thinking end to end in terms of offering multiple distribution methods, perhaps a debit card, perhaps they want to get it in a, let's say Google or PayPal, right, Apple digital wallet, or perhaps some of them want a portion of their payroll to go get into a crypto wallet, right? So are we offering distribution mechanisms that are broad enough to satisfy the needs of the beneficiaries, and how are we, what's our roadmap to add new ones? And then what type of tools to allow them to perhaps distribute that paycheck among multiple, right, wallets are we offering to our clients? So I would add those as two important pieces of our roadmap going forward in the payroll space.
Absolutely fascinating. None of these options, Jonathan, and thank you, Carmen. None of these options, or many of these options, not only did they not exist, you would probably not have accommodated them, just a few years ago. And now you've got to accommodate all of it wherever you are. Your thoughts on the results here? What do you think?
Yeah, I think Carmen absolutely nailed it at the end. Is people want to choose how they get paid nowadays. Whether it be PayPal, whether it be crypto, whether it be to their bank account, that's employee choice, right? It's really the only thing that's accrued and paid at the end of the month is your salary, or end of the cycle, right? You don't go to the grocery, or you don't go to the supermarket, buy your milk and bread and everything, and go, by the way, I'll pay you at the end of the month, don't worry about it. So really, it's the only thing that's not down to consumer choice at this point in time. So I think that evolution is coming. And as we talk broadly about workforce, right, we've talked a lot around payroll, but contractors, still a huge part of the world, the gig economy space where people are changing the way that they're consuming and working as well. People are wanting to be paid in real time. This whole delay of 1 or 2 days is no longer going to be something that's acceptable within the market. If you were sending money to a family member, would you accept waiting 2 days? Probably not. So why is it okay for payroll to accept that, or workforce, or any kind of related payments? So I think that kind of essence of real time and the data privacy security is, of course, absolutely key, and links directly to that around using locally approved suppliers, making sure you're using the right kind of regulations and guidelines to check your partners. Don't just use anyone down the street. You need to make sure you're doing your due diligence on the right partner, who's the right fit, and asking the right kind of questions, and catering to your workforce. I think it comes down to every business is themselves. Like if I speak to family members, my parents, for example, and say, I'm going to pay you into an e-wallet, I think they would be like, what? What is an e-wallet and how do I do that? Like, where do I buy one of those? Whereas the kind of Generation Z or X or all of the others, or Gen Z or everyone else, that's a standard way of thinking, or gamifying payments and all sorts of other things. So we've got a very interesting world that we are evolving into now, that's changing the narrative that we have known for so long. What payments were 30 years ago, which was cash, is no longer acceptable. I still was talking to someone the other day and I couldn't believe how many checks are drafted in the US still. In the UK, I don't think I've seen a checkbook in 5 or 6 years. Sorry if anyone got a checkbook in the UK, but I haven't seen one in years. So I think, again, it all comes down to the world is an ever-changing animal that we've got to try and stay on top of. People are the most important part of any business and any kind of foundation for that. So this is a really interesting topic. It's definitely not one that's ever going to stop. It's just how can we change and keep up to date with the world. And I think exactly as Sanjeev and Carmen said, it's all about kind of collaboration, working in unison, listening to industry experts, and the idea of purpose-built technology as well.
Yeah, no, It's absolutely fascinating to me because only a few years ago, it would have been unheard of for you to demand to be paid a certain way. It would have been, you get what you get. We just need this information from you, then we'll deal with it. And that has completely changed. Let's do our last poll as we kind of head near the end here. Let's do our last poll, and then we'll capture some last questions from our responses from our panelists. How complex is managing this process? You've got contractors, employees, whatever you call them, freelancers, authorities across multiple regions. Is it extremely complex? Moderately? Some places more difficult than others, not too. We manage most pretty easily, or absolutely no complexity. If it says no complexity, I think you're going to be hired by Jonathan because he figures you know everything about this space, or any of our other folks as well. We've got two other people who work all the time with payroll. Answer those questions, if you will, audience, and we're going to go ahead and move towards wrapping up. We've got a few more minutes left. I think we don't have any other questions from the audience that we haven't already addressed, so that's great. If we could give a couple quick examples, Sanjeev, from your experience where things have really happened successfully and why. If you could keep it to just a couple minutes, that'd be great because we're going to wrap up shortly. But just when has it really worked and what was there that made it work?
So an example that comes to mind is that we have gone through an RFP process with another the European bank, and to win some of the business payments into the US for low value payments to the US. And what worked really well is having a really open process for discussion with your potential partners. So early in the process, we had a couple of different clauses with them that gave us a documentation what their requirements were. And then through the RFP process, we realized that actually what they were looking for was slightly different. They didn't have that full, what the actual requirements were was slightly different to what they were asking for. And this wasn't a big issue for us. We could accommodate this. But what we suggested to them is like, we played it back. So here's what we think your requirements are. Check this, and then go out to your other providers. So you're actually comparing everyone on a level footing. Some other partners may have said to them, ignored it, and then just put in a change request and charged them for it, and that kind of thing. And then we went through that process, and now we're at the implementation stage, and it just feels really easy because we've had all of those discussions beforehand, and we can picture where we're going to be. We can picture what every step that needs to be done, and having that open and frank discussion. And then once you've gone through those discussions, replaying everything back so you can compare like for like across the board, because it really helps.
Awesome. Thank you for that example. I know you've given some other ones earlier. As we wrap up here, let's go ahead and see the results of our panel. Results of our poll, and then we'll go to our panel for one last question. How complex? Well, half say it's extremely or moderately, so that means it's at least moderately complex and very possibly higher on the end of how tough it is to actually make these workforce payments across multiple regions to all sorts of people. And it brings us to our last question for each one of you, and it's really two parts. Take either part, just let's do it in 1 minute each if we could. What would you prioritize right now? If you were going to make a provider choice decisions on tackling and executing well for global workforce payments, your actual customers, your corporate customers, and their payees, what's that one key ingredient that you've always find that you'd like to see in every one of these initial projects and also ongoing maintenance? I'll start with you, Sanjeev. That one thing.
So I think this may be what Jonathan and Tom are going to say to an extent as well, but I think that what comes to mind is that the world is complex, and I think we've covered that quite a lot on this call anyway. But the good thing is you don't have to navigate it by yourself, and that's the one key thing you should do is find the right partner, and who you can work with, who has knowledge of different areas, and who has contacts I think you can utilise as well. So I'm lucky working at BNY, I've got colleagues across the globe, and can find out a lot about the different local markets. But what's kind of unique is that we're a bank that specializes in providing services to other banks. And so we can go and ask people for get their feedback without them fearing that we're going to try and steal their corporate retail customers. But choosing the right partner is essential. It makes things so much easier from beginning to end.
Thank you, Sanjeev. Carmen, from your experience, that one key ingredient that you would always want to have?
I think staying close to your clients and hearing their pain points, right, to always address them, right? So we want to push the payments for employees in the direction of, efficient from a cost perspective, right, fast, 24/7, right, real time, as we said, safe, so they get to the intended beneficiary in that safe and cost efficient manner. But I think hearing the needs of our clients, right, is very important. Some of them, as we said, because of their legacy platforms, limited resources and technology, still need to use checks for those measures. How can we help taking those checks, digitizing them, and giving them the tools that they don't have? While for others who are more complex, right, how do we listen to their needs, integrate better, offer better traceability tools and insights? We didn't even mention virtual accounts, but those are a very large, use case for our fintech and our technology partners. So always listening to their needs, seeing what their pain points are, and building right services to meet them where they are.
Perfect. Jonathan, you've got the final word on this. What's that secret sauce to make all this work?
So first of all, I'm going to echo everything that Sanjeev and Carmen said. That's the get out of jail free card, right? Saying that. So definitely echo everything that they have both said. But for me, it's compliance is key. Understanding or speaking to a provider that truly understands the intricacies of those payroll payments. They are not like other payments. They are kind of like super payments, as I call them. So actually having someone that can understand and tell you how to deliver those in a compliant way is super important. It's not just about, I can make a payment into Singapore. It's how do you make the net? How do you make the tax? How do you make the social and all the other contributions? So compliant, and then obviously just core technology, right? We live in a world where technology, APIs, everything like that is an absolute core focus and a necessity. So ensuring compliance, but also ensuring efficiency of data automation is absolutely key as well.
Just excellent summary. I wrote down, find the right provider, stay close to your customers, be efficient, be secure, and finally be compliant, and find someone who really knows what it means to be compliant wherever those people want to be paid, because they now have, we won't say necessarily the absolute upper hand, but they certainly have a lot of input into how this process is going to work. I want to thank my panelists for an outstanding and really illuminating session. Jonathan Nash, Senior Director of Payments for Papaya Global, and our sponsor. Thank you. Carmen Pogorski from Wells Fargo, Global Payments Lead. Sanjeev Bhatti, Product Management, Direct Clearing for BNY. For our audience, thank you for attending. Thanks for your questions, your poll participation. You can always watch this if you'd like on replay or share it with your colleagues. This is a very, very big issue, and it's going to continue to evolve as we go. Thanks everyone for coming today to our Finextra webinar, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you.